Welcome to the public meeting for the San Antonio Airport System Strategic Development Plan. We appreciate your taking the time to be with us for this meeting, one of three identical public meetings for the Strategic Development Plan, or SDP, this week. My name is Gretchen Roofs, and I am the consulting team's Deputy Project Manager for Stakeholder Engagement for the SDP, and I will be your moderator for today's meeting. A few housekeeping items. Except for the presenters and the panelists, all participants' microphones and cameras will not be turned on and will remain so during the entire meeting. So, if you're here with us as a participant and your dog barks or your phone rings, don't worry, no one else will hear those things. If you would like to view the meeting at a later date, you can go to the SDP website at sanantonio.gov/SATfuture and watch the recorded version of this meeting, which will be posted on the website by February 15th. If you have joined this meeting by telephone only, you can email satfuture@sanantonio.gov to ask questions, make comments, or request a printed copy of today's presentation. As a reminder, this is a Strategic Development Plan public meeting during which we will update you on the status of the airport planning alternatives that are being considered to accommodate growth at the San Antonio International Airport over the next 20 years. Towards the end of the meeting, we will also be providing information on the new development principles related to the sense of place for the airport. If you are here because you would like to hear about the update to the noise exposure map, often referred to as the NEM, please note that the NEM workshops are scheduled for next week on February 16th, 17th, 18th, and 22nd. We will not be talking about the noise exposure map update at this meeting. If you would like more information about next week's NEM meetings, the airport noise hotline phone and email address are posted on your screen. Tonight's meeting is expected to run about 2 hours, and several question and answer segments are included in the agenda. At the conclusion of the formal presentation about the SDP, we will answer your questions in the order they are received, starting with the questions that were submitted prior to the meeting. To submit a question during this Strategic Development Plan meeting, please type your question into the Q&A feature on your screen. Finally, if you are having trouble viewing the meeting or hearing the speakers or presentations, please type in your request for help into the Q&A feature on your screen, and one of our technical support team members will assist you. Now we will hear a welcome from the Director of Airports for the San Antonio Airport System, Jesus Saenz, who will provide some opening remarks before we start the SDP presentation.
On behalf of the San Antonio Airport System, welcome to our Strategic Development Plan public meeting. We are excited to have you with us for this public meeting, and we have some great information to share with you. First, we'll provide an update to you about the Strategic Development Plan, which many of you have been involved in over the past couple of years. We're also going to give you a sneak preview of our development principles related to our commitment to bringing more of a sense of place to our terminals. Before we begin, however, I'd like to give you a few updates about what's going on at the airport these days. The San Antonio International Airport has continued to outpace the national average in terms of passengers. We are currently at 35% of 2019 levels of passengers. We had service to 22 nonstop destinations in December, compared to 41 in 2019, with a strong return of service to Mexico, including recently announced Sun Country Airlines nonstop service to Cancun International Airport. Mexico service is pretty much back to where it was last year, so we are very fortunate in that regard. We have 62% of our concessions operating and expect to have 2 to 3 additional concepts, including Boss Bagel and Sip Brew and market opening soon. Other concessionaires that have opened in the past year include Smoke Shack, Local Coffee, and the Spur Store. I think people will be happy to know that there is now a food service option in the pre-security area of Terminal B, outside of the consolidated car rental facility. It's a Dunkin' Donuts Express counter, open from 4 a.m. to 2 p.m. We know that many of you in recent strategic development plan surveys requested access to food and beverages in the pre-security area of the airport, and we want you to know that we heard you. Our team has been very focused on responding to the challenges created by the COVID-19 virus. One of our COVID-19 responses involved the purchase of a robot that disinfects surfaces around jet bridges, gate areas, counters, baggage claims, restrooms, and other high traffic areas. We were proud to partner with San Antonio-based Xenix to introduce this germ zapping technology to the airport. So let's get on with our meeting. Again, 2 topics today: an update to the strategic development plan and a preview of a new development guidelines project we've started to bring sense of place to all future airport undertakings. While we would love to be with you in person to talk about our strategic development plan and our efforts related to a more defined sense of place, we're delighted to see that our SDP meeting attendance is at an all-time high. We believe the virtual nature of these meetings is making them more accessible to our community than in-person meetings are, and for that, we are grateful. Thank you for being here and for your interest in the future of the San Antonio airport system. We look forward to hearing your questions and your thoughts.
Our thanks to Jesus Signs for that very nice welcome. David Robbins, who is Chief Development Officer for the San Antonio Airport System, recently joined the airport's executive team. David has over 22 years of experience in aviation public works, most recently at the Chicago Department of Aviation, and he would like to say a few words. David?
Thank you, Gretchen. Just want to mirror the words of our director, Jesus Signs, and welcome everyone. I'm pleased to be here and to join you all, our stakeholders, neighbors, team members in forming our strategic development plan. It's widely known that San Antonio is one of the fastest growing cities in America. And as a part of this process, this process really puts us ahead of the curve in addressing the best ways to accommodate the expected long-term growth and expansion needs of the airport and the region. You all, our community members, neighbors, and stakeholders are very important to the SDP and to the future of San Antonio International Airport. Where COVID precludes us from meeting in person, I'm pleased to have this opportunity to meet you all virtually and to have you join us in this process of developing the future San Antonio International Airport for the community of San Antonio and this South region of Texas. Thank you, Gretchen.
Thank you, David, for your comments.
Welcome.
John Van Woensel is a consulting team's project manager for the San Antonio Airport System Strategic Development Plan. He is Vice President and National Aviation Planning Manager for WSP. John will present the recap of the SDP's progress to date and the status of the airport planning alternatives being considered to accommodate growth at the San Antonio International Airport over the next 20 years. John?
Thank you, Gretchen. Yes, let's jump right into it. So on the agenda today, we have these topics. And if we say SDP inadvertently throughout this, the reminder is its strategic development plan, the plan for the airport. First item is we'll give you a bit of an overview of where we are in the grand scheme of the study, a recap of some of the work that we've done. And I know that some of you have been at our meetings in the past and probably have recollection, but it's been almost a year since we had our last meeting. So we'll definitely do a bit of a recap. Then we'll talk about the current phase of the work. We refer to it as phase 2 because it was a new phase of the contract. And then we'll have ample time for Q&A. So let's get into the overview here. On this slide, it's a little busy. It has a lot of information on it. We'll come back to it at the end of the presentation if you're trying to take notes. But what you see here is the check mark for the airfield plan. We'll report out on that today. It's done, the 2040 plan. What we're working on currently is a terminal plan. We'll give you a bit of a status update. We're not done with that yet. Next will be the landside plan. So that's all the access to the airport, roadways, from the highway on the airport in front of Terminal A where it could use improvement, and also VIA's plans for transit access to the airport. And then we'll look at the tenants to support facilities cargo as well. And then next you'll see that after we have a 2040 plan, we need to figure out how do you get there, how do you pay for it, what are the logical phases. All that will be done later this year, and you'll see today's meeting represented with a public workshop box. We have another one of these boxes toward the end because in around September, August, September, we'll have another round of meetings like this, and then ultimately this goes before council. So we'll talk through these phases of the work a little bit more as we go, and then as I mentioned, we'll come back to this image at the end. So on the next slide, you see here an image you may recollect. We used this in 2018 at a number of open houses, as well as with City Council and various other committees. And this is the actual image. Now that blue cloud over there, I'll explain what that is. It's not a runway. We looked at the first phase at the 50-year horizon. The reason for that was because when we started all this, there was a lot of interest in the community, a lot of debate about a new airport. Can the needs be met here? At the time, there was a lot of construction work going on at the airport, so it was congested. And it didn't seem like the right way to go to just look at the international airport and say, yes, it'll fit. How do we know this? So in order to address the question appropriately, we came up with an approach where we said, let's really test this site. Let's really see if it can meet the long-term demand. So we did that by looking at the 50 years I mentioned, which is really, you know, more than any normal planning horizon, and that's on purpose. We also exaggerated demand, because if you can meet exaggerated demand, aggressive demand, and you know you're good with more likely demand. Also, we assume that various facilities such as new terminals or runways would come online sooner than actually needed. They'd come online early, again, to try to really exaggerate everything to see if we can accommodate that, then we know we're good. And so that's the answer that we came up with. And you see here this cloud diagram. There could be a whole variety of different runway concepts in there, everything from a widely spaced runway towards the, but inside the Wurzbach or closer to the existing main runway. The point of this exercise was to look at that range of options, not to pick a specific plan. So you see the same with the terminal. The green area in the center there is the current Terminal A and Terminal B footprint. And when you look at a 50-year exaggerated terminal need, we found that about 63 gates, you know, it could be what you might possibly need. So we determined what that footprint would be, and you can see the blue and the yellow cloud are two options of where that might go. Obviously, there would be tenant relocation, and the yellow cloud couldn't happen until after the crosswind runway closes in the long term, but this is a 50-year plan. Also, we looked at another slide that we don't have here today with a midfield terminal complex, so in between two widely spaced runways. So again, we weren't trying to pick a specific plan. We were just trying to look at, could it be made to fit? And there's several options, several ways you could make it fit. So that answered the question. So then we had another slide we used at these meetings, the open houses and with council, where we specifically said, will it fit? The answer is yes. And there's of course some caveats, including governmental approvals, including funding and environmental approvals. Some land acquisition would be needed, and several other caveats. But so this was accepted by council this, October 31st, 2018, and that answered the question. So then we needed to change to a new phase of work. So, okay, now that we know that, we're not looking for a new airport site. We're looking at how to best make things fit at this airport. So we kind of changed gears. We said in phase two, okay, now we're starting over. Now we need to figure out how it's going to fit. If we know it fits, how is it going to fit in 20-year horizon? So we looked, instead of at the high growth, the aggressive excuse me, growth scenario, we looked at what's the most likely growth scenario. Same with the horizon. 50 years is really kind of out there, but now we're doing more realistic planning. Let's look at a more reasonable planning horizon, and that's 20 years, which is also the FAA's typical planning horizon for efforts like this. And lastly, we didn't have things coming online extra early. Now we want to plan for things when they're more likely to actually be needed, so that the plan is more usable. So that's kind of where we started with phase 2. And then the first thing you start with when you do these types of efforts is the airfield. This is the existing airfield, and you can kind of see why we start with the airfield. It takes up most of the property. There's all kinds of safety rules and setbacks and airspace associated also with these runways. So that's where we start. Just to orient everybody, this is north is up on this image. So what you see is the main runways are 13 right from the upper left-hand corner of your image to the lower right-hand corner. 13 right, 31 left is the main direction of the airfield. Parallel to that runway is a smaller general aviation runway used by smaller aircraft primarily. And then you see a T intersection where the runways meet. And then the runway that goes up to the right corner of the screen is what's called a crosswind runway. And that's runway 422. It is the same length as runway 13 right, but the 13 and 31 direction is the main direction of the airport. And then you can see the terminal area down below. And now that we have oriented ourselves, let's talk a little bit about the needs we're trying to accommodate. So there are a number of needs, and they sort of fall into these three clear categories. The first one is safety. Everything in aviation, every aspect of aviation is about safety and always looking for ways to enhance it and make it better. So we'll show you a specific opportunity here in a moment. The next thing is, as the city grows, as you heard, this is a rapidly growing city. And as cities grow, airlines tend to want to look at that market and to more and farther international destinations. So we need to plan for what that means. Also related to growth is more passengers also affects the airfield. It means more aircraft movements. More aircraft movements means at some point you can't process enough aircraft on the airfield anymore, and you start to have delay and congestion. Right now you don't have that, but we want to make sure you don't get that in the future. And so we need to look at what is the capacity of the airfield. How do you accommodate the growth in operations? Oops, sorry. A little bit more about the safety needs. So this is a blow up of the image you saw a minute ago. So the runway going to the upper right-hand corner of the screen is that crosswind runway 422. And you can see the beginning of runway 31 left there is right on top of runway 422. There's an aircraft there actually on runway 422, if you can see it. And what occasionally happens, and this is rare, but we don't want it to ever happen, is someone inadvertently misses the stop markings there and goes toward the runway or actually onto the runway. That's because the geometry there, the layout, the physical layout can be disorienting to some pilots who are busy doing other things, aren't familiar with the airfield. And so we want to look at opportunities to make that geometry, that layout over there, so that it's essentially foolproof and people can't inadvertently taxi onto the runway. So that was the safety opportunity or need that we looked at. The second need was about serving these farther destinations, especially internationally. We looked at a number of aircraft. For tonight, we just have two examples here. These are commonly used international aircraft, the 787 by Boeing and the Airbus A350. And you can see in the red and the green line here, the current range of these aircraft off your existing runway. So you already have pretty good range. But if you look far enough out in the future and you want to get to, for example, Southern Latin America, you want to get deeper into Europe or Asia, if the airlines want to serve those markets, they need a longer runway. And you can see here, those markets can be reached with about a 10,000 foot runway. You'll see more about that number in a moment. That third need was about the growth in operations, so the number of aircraft movements on the airfield. And what you see on this graph on the left side is a 20-year period we're working in. The right side was from the 50-year effort. And the green line is the most likely forecast. So that's the FAA approved current forecast of aircraft movements on the airfield. And you can see that before the end of the planning period, there's that orange box. That's an improvement to the existing runway. The capacity of that is slightly suboptimal. And so we'll talk about that in a moment, but that would be the first thing you do. Once that's been done and growth continues, at some point, you need to look at what's the next significant increase in capacity. And for the purpose of this exercise, we're not assuming FAA technology will improve or do away with that. We want to make sure we're ready for the future and consider the physical options. So looking at the next option, that would be a closely spaced parallel runway. And if you see the green line there where it intersects with that, you don't really need that until about 2048. Should demand be much stronger, all the way up to that purple line, the aggressive forecast, the high growth forecast, then you might be looking at closer to 2038, 2040. So really a parallel runway is outside of the 20-year planning period, but we will look at that orange improvement to the existing runway in a moment. So those are the three needs we're trying to accommodate. And now let's talk about the solutions. We developed a whole range of potential solutions and then went around trying to gather more ideas. In the middle there, you see a working group coming up with ideas in August of 2019. We then took those ideas, and as we started evaluating them, we put them in a binder, which you can see on the left there. We had all the options in there. Ended up with 91 options, took them to various public events, asked people, showed people what we had, and asked them, are there any other ideas, anything we're missing? We wanted to make sure we had all ideas on the table, that we weren't just starting with things that had been looked at before or things that we technical folks thought would be a good idea. So we literally got enormous range of input, including a circular runway and runways outside of the current freeways that surround the airport. On this next slide, you see the evaluation process of those options. So we started with 91, we ended up with 2 and ultimately 1. What you see here is sort of a we are here chart. The star started out on the left side there as we had the 91 concepts. And as we evaluated them, some were carried forward with the green arrow, some were modified if they had a flaw that could be improved upon. And if not, they were dropped out in that round and fewer carried forward. You may have seen that at some of our previous meetings because we kept tracking where we were as we went along. Here are a few fatal flaws. A fatal flaw is kind of a funny term for a make or break criterion that you use early in these evaluations. So when you're trying to add more runway length, when you're trying to provide for more capacity in the long term, you don't want to look at alternatives that decrease capacity or make safety worse or things like that. So those are make or break factors that we came up with that knocked out quite a few alternatives. And you'll see one here we'll talk a little bit more about as an example, which is the primary runway conflict with Randolph. So not conflict with Randolph, the primary runways conflict with Randolph. A little bit more about that here in a minute. So again, we started with 91 concepts, and a full 35 of those had some variation of a northeast runway. So that's a crosswind runway that they either extended or added a parallel to, or sometimes even 2 parallels to. In other words, these were ideas that people came up with that made the direction of the airport from the current directions and switch at 90 degrees into the northeast direction. And those were eliminated because what those do is what's today a manageable conflict becomes worse. And also, therefore, the capacity increase of the airport would not be provided either. I know this topic is of a lot of interest to people, so we heard about this and got questions about this at our various meetings, public events. So this is one of the images that shows what the issue is. So SAT is San Antonio, R&D is Randolph Air Force Base, about 11 miles to the east. And what you see here is this interference in the airspace that occurs during departures as well as arrivals. So the yellow arrow is San Antonio, orange is Randolph. And to make it worse, these flight paths cross not just two-dimensionally, they actually cross at more or less the same altitude as well. So the controllers currently deal with the situation. They talk to each other. They have a memorandum of understanding between the facilities. So it's safe and it's something they can manage. Mostly what they do is when Randolph has a big mission, San Antonio yields, which means San Antonio stops using 422 and goes to the 1331 direction, which is that main direction, until the Randolph sorties or activity is over. There's also another base to the southwest where there's some interference, but this is really the main interference. And today it's very manageable. But you can see that if you made the main direction of San Antonio, the constant flow in the direction of the yellow arrow, that you make what is today a manageable problem into something that stops the airport from operating periodically. And obviously that's not viable. Also stopping operations at Randolph, of course, is not viable. So those types of alternatives were not considered further, and this is why. So when we last met in March, we had two alternatives on the table at the time for the airfield. And they look similar at this scale and they're fairly similar. Let me just describe quickly the difference and which one was preferred. So on the left, you see the main runway here in this bright pink color, extended, in this case, over 281, more about that in a minute as well. And in the one on the right, you see the current short runway extended to be the long runway and go across the highway. Both of these work fine in about the 2040 timeframe. The problem is in getting there. So with the alternative on the right, you really can't have a longer runway until you build that parallel. And in the chart we just had a minute ago, you saw that the parallel is not needed until after the 20-year period. So that means you really wouldn't have an opportunity to extend a runway if the airlines wanted to go to farther destinations. So it kind of ties your hands. Whereas with the left alternative, you have the opportunity to extend the existing main runway in small increments as needed before the parallel is built, decades from now. So in the end, that's why alternative, then called AF14 as a technical working drawing, became the preferred alternative. And then we left off. Here's why we left off. And the virus looks a lot more friendly here than some images I've seen of it. But we basically got interrupted by the virus, and we were able to hold 4 public events. So we had pop-up meetings, we had coffee clutches, we had our technical advisory committee meetings with the study committees. And then we were about to go out to the full open house, and we had to stop because of the virus and the city's ordinance, and the study was stopped and all meetings stopped. So we paused all the work to figure out what this meant in mid-March, restarted work later in the year, and currently are underway and are giving you this update on what we've achieved. One last note on COVID, which is that the current forecast that we're using, which is that most likely line, may be off. We know in the near term what the COVID impacts are. Things are well below any kind of forecast in the next few years, but longer term, we're not really sure. Are we going to recover in a few years? Will we be back on track, or is it a more permanent shift? There's a lot of debate about this in the industry. And so what we're doing is, for now, we are continuing to use the existing forecast, but in a few months, we're going to put our heads together, talk to FAA and say, okay, do we keep doing this? And maybe we're kind of over planning, and we may not actually need some of the projects we're coming up with, or are we going to shift the forecast, or perhaps even completely redo the forecast? And so we don't know that yet. We recognize we might be slightly over planning for projects that may not be needed and will not happen when we think they might happen. So more on that as we update and have a decision on that. So we talked about these airfield needs that are shown here in the top boxes, tops of these boxes. We explained them in the lower half of the boxes, but instead of talking through words, let's look at some exhibits that show what the solutions are. So first, in the sort of near the midfield, the up to 10-year time frame, the project you see here is a solution solution T intersection that exists today, where people confuse runway ends with the other runway and inadvertently have that incursion, as it's called. What we've come up with after a number of technical meetings with all the airside stakeholders is a short extension of that end of the runway to basically relocate the end off the other runway. So someone taxiing there will no longer be able to confuse the two ends because the one end's over off the other runway, making it visually clear where the runway end is. You also see a little taxiway there connecting to it so aircraft can wait over there. And this has been reviewed with a safety risk panel and found to be a viable solution. Of course, any of these projects are subject to final FAA and city sign off, but preliminarily, this is the solution for the safety enhancement at the airport. Looking a little bit farther out in the future, in this 10 to 20 year time frame, there's two projects. One is the big one, so we circled it, but there's a small one for those who are interested. Right across from the terminal area is an angled taxiway coming off the runway. There's one there fairly close to that today, but it's not in the ideal location for today's aircraft fleet mix. And also the angle isn't quite ideal. So what we're proposing to do is to address that with this particular taxiway that's shown here. It'll allow aircraft to get off the runway more quickly, which will increase the throughput rate of the runway somewhat and postpones the need for any further capacity enhancements like the parallel runway. But the big project you see here is this extension on the other end. So we talked before, on the one end, we have about 340 feet of extension. What we're looking at here on the other end is about 1,250 feet. That takes us just short of 281. And this gets us that 10,000 feet that we saw on the range chart work so well for international long-haul flights. So this fits just perfectly on the property and makes a lot of sense. A little bit more detail here because that's it's different scales to show you a little bit more what we're talking about. So this is the current north end of the runway. You can see the numbers there. And then you see 1,250 feet of extension with those arrows on it. And that stops short of 281 on the property. The little inset there, we won't go through all those numbers, but the point of that is to show you we did a bunch of engineering work to make sure this could be done. And also to figure out what height, what elevation should the runway end be at, so that if in 30 or 40 years, future generations who are going to be flying on future airlines to future destinations find that they still do need that 10,700 feet, those last 700 feet, there is that opportunity in the future to consider going over 281. We've coordinated with TxDOT, and they're aware of the thinking on this, but what you're seeing here is an elevation that would work, and this would fit on the property, and we made sure that it did. So this is what that 10,000 feet on airport would look like. And that's the airfield. Now let's talk about the terminal, the other big component. There's a number of needs there as well. They can be grouped in three categories. Again, first, it's about accommodating growth, but not just accommodating growth. For the terminal, we said, let's look at high growth because it's so disruptive to do expansion to a terminal building while it's in use, because that's always the situation you're in airports. So let's make sure that when we do an improvement, it lasts long enough, it has enough capacity, so we don't have to come back a few years later and rip everything back up again. So that's why we're looking at high growth demand, just to make sure we can accommodate it. The other need is we need to make sure we have a world-class experience for the customers, for the travelers. This we heard from the mayor's appointed committee, the airports system development committee, as well as our advisory committees and the general public. We got lots of feedback on that. That's what people are expecting, and that's what we're planning for. The third need that really needs addressed is Terminal A. Terminal A dates back to the 80s. It's functionally obsolete, meaning today's aircraft, today's use, the space doesn't quite work for that, as well as the systems. Everything that's behind the wall or underneath the floor is starting to get old to little details like electrical systems and sewers. So that's all an issue that we're aware of, we need to look at. On this next slide, a little bit about the existing terminal physical plant. You probably don't see it from this angle very often, but on the right, you see Terminal A with the concourse going to the north and the south. And you can see particularly on the south, just how narrow that is. Even the north is actually well below today's standards. Terminal B is a little bit more recent, of course, but even it is not quite up to all the standards. And one of the issues with both terminals, and we've had lots of feedback from people on this, is the fact that you have 2 security checkpoints. And once you go through security, you're limited to just being in that portion of the airport. Those concessions, and in the case of American Airlines, you have American gates on both terminals, so it can be confusing. And if you want to eat in that restaurant that's on the other concourse and you're already through security, it's really not very practicable to think you can go back out of security and back in to go over there. So that's a big drawback. And when you look at the space that is there today, if you were to plan this all today, you would have a lot more space. So today things are already at least 13% undersized. And of course, we're not looking at today, we're looking at 2040. So by then you'll also need another 12 or so additional gates. It's hard to remember this with COVID, but in these pictures, you can see just before COVID, during the peak times, how busy it got in the airport. Some of you, if you travel during the peaks, you've experienced this. If you travel once or twice a year, or perhaps on airlines that don't fly during the peak much, you may not have seen this, and you may not be aware of just how bad it can get. Image on the upper right is Terminal A looking north. So that's the wider part of Terminal A. Gives you an idea of the other direction. And on the lower image, that's bag claim in Terminal A. And you get 2 flights over there with people waiting on their bags, and it is just jam-packed for a half hour or so until the next flights come in, and then it repeats. So not an acceptable level of service. This has to be addressed. So where we left off, we talked about where we left off at the airfield. Where we left off at the terminals in March was this. And I'll walk quickly through what this was, because it's been a while. But what you see here, starting on the bottom end of the exhibit, is a completely rebuilt Concourse A. So that skinny part and even the top part are built to a more modern standard. We'll show you in a minute what that standard is. The yellow over the ticketing and bag claim portions of A and B, as well as the gates of B, Terminal B, are renovations, because even Terminal B, which today you can still think of as sort of new, it's already 10 years old, but in 2040 it'll be 30 years old. So you'll probably need to do some renovation on it by then. And then the big new thing here on this slide is the new Terminal C. And this was the general layout and location we had when we stopped. So with the COVID delay, we had a chance to kind of rethink what the C could look like and refine where we left off. I mentioned today's standards. So some of the standards we're using as we look at these new terminal alternatives are on the right, and you'll see the existing terminals A and B on the left. And you can just see that the north end of A, where we saw that crowd, that's only 77 feet wide, and the southern end is even less than that. And what we're planning for is 110-foot wide concourse, which is kind of the new industry benchmark. If there were international gates on one side, it would be wider, about 120 feet. If you had an alternative where there might be international gates on both sides of a concourse, you would need to be wider still, about 140 or so. So those are some of the dimensions that we're looking at from a technical perspective in the terminal alternatives right now. But beyond just technical ideas and people staring at this, we've gotten extensive feedback from the various committees we've mentioned, but also to open houses, and people have filled out surveys, given us comments on the website, and you can see here it had just tremendous participation in the surveys, and this goes back to 2018. And in fact, we're still open to input and would ask you to go to the website and let us know things that you don't feel are captured here, or add your voice to the mix. But an additional 700 people took the time to actually fill in by hand additional observations beyond just the survey questions. And when you rank all this information, you can see that the concessions, especially food, were really on people's mind. More options, bigger restaurants, more sit down, more fast casual, a lot of good feedback. People wanted more space, terminal expansion, modernization. People wanted a better experience. So this matches with what we were looking at on the technical side, what Jesus has been saying, the director, and what you've all been saying. So it's all pointing in the same direction. This is all part of what we're looking at. So we are still in the middle of developing terminals and don't have a final preferred plan or anything like that to show you. Here's some other comments we got. We just picked these out because they really capture it well. You can see that people want the local character of the city represented in a building, so you know where you are. People want world class, and on the bottom, you can see even some very specific suggestions about what that might mean to people, the local flavor of world class. So lots of comments like this, 738 to be specific. So that's all being considered in the terminal concepts we're developing right now. And so let's talk about what we're doing next, because I just mentioned we don't have a final terminal plan yet. But on this schedule exhibit that we had a minute ago, you can see kind of where we are. The airfield plan is done. We're working on the terminal plan below it. The landside plan, as I mentioned, that includes roads as well as transit. And cargo, support facilities, other tenants, potential new tenants. That's all together. And then we're going to look at, okay, what are the orderly steps to get there? Once we have a 2040 plan, how do we pay for it? What are the environmental and other approvals that are required before any of these things can happen? And that then all is the plan and goes before another series of public workshops and city council, of course, who ultimately will decide to adopt this plan. So that's where we are with the plan. And these are some of the efforts in the circle here that we're focusing on right now. So that's our update for tonight. And we have plenty of time for Q&A. So I'll stop with the presentation and we can switch to the Q&A period. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We are now going to begin the question and answer portion of this meeting. Please use the Q&A feature on your screen to submit your questions. Your questions and names will not be seen or made public because it is our policy to not share participants' names and contact information. Only the staff will see the questions. We'll be focusing on questions related to the strategic development plan during this meeting. We will start by answering the questions that we received via phone or email before this meeting began, and then we'll respond to the questions that are submitted during this meeting. We may group questions together based on related topics in order to attempt to answer all questions we receive during this meeting. Now I'm pleased to introduce our panelists who are subject matter experts. David Robbins, who you already met, is Chief Development Officer for the San Antonio Airport System and oversees the Strategic Development Plan. Susan St. Cyr is Special Projects Manager for the San Antonio Airport System and is the airport's Strategic Development Plan Project Manager. Chris Anderson is Business Process Manager for the San Antonio Airport System and is SDP Stakeholder Engagement Task Leader for the airport. Ryan Hall is the Airport Principal Planner for the San Antonio Airport System and is a member of the SDP project team. John Van Woensel, who just presented the SDP update to you, is the consulting team's project manager for the SDP and is Vice President and National Aviation Planning Manager for WSP. Mark Koutras is a consulting team's Deputy Project Manager for Facilities Planning and is Assistant Vice President and Senior Aviation Planner for WSP. Tracy Beach is the consulting team's Deputy Project Manager for Business and Financial Planning and is Project Manager and Senior Aviation Financial Planner for WSP. And I am the Deputy Project Manager for Stakeholder Engagement for the SDP and am the owner of AMS, a San Antonio-based small business. So with that, we will start with the questions. I am going to refer this first question to Mark. Is there any or can there be public access plan to the northern side of the planned expansion near the Wurzbach Parkway and Jones-Malzberger intersection? By public access, I am referring to passenger terminals for both commercial airlines and private hangars, as well as cargo shipping terminals.
Yes, so is the terminal and the long-term 2040 plan comes together, there's space needed to expand both cargo and airlines and maintenance facilities. And today you can get to the north side of the airfield just north of the parallel runways to access corporate hangars and the maintenance facilities, and the cargo carriers are currently located along Wetmore. So as the expansion and the customers' needs grow over the next 20 years, there is space available within that envelope to accommodate those needs. So going between closer to the Wurzbach where the Salado Creek is not necessary in the 20-year time frame.
Thanks, Mark. This next question is for John. Consultants said extension was safer than having 13 right stop at runway 4. Stated that Southwest pilot vouched extension was safer and several other pilots did as well. What was the Southwest pilot's name and position? What were the names of the other pilots?
I think for privacy reasons, we're not going to list names of individuals here, but the process we're talking about is something pretty official. We had several informal meetings, safety type meetings, and then we had a formal safety risk assessment meeting, which is a FAA process that looks at making sure that an improvement actually makes things safer. So some of the people we had there were the airlines. All the airlines were invited. A number participated in the meetings, and some gave comments afterwards. So all the major airlines at the airport were invited. We also had, of course, the airport's operations staff there. They manage the airfield. They know how things flow. FAA was there, and when I say FAA, I'm talking about Airports Division, the headquarters in DC, safety folks, as well as the air traffic controllers. Then we had all the large tenants on the airfield who operate aircraft, such as some of the corporate tenants and the fixed base operations, FBOs, also participated, as well as the cargo carriers. Both cargo carriers were invited. So we had about 35 airside stakeholders involved. This was not a casual conversation with the Southwest or other pilot. And we didn't ask people for who had a pilot's license, but I know we had at least a half a dozen pilots in the room there and official airline reps. So that's the meeting I think that the reference is being made to. And I don't think we can give names of specific people. So that's why I thought it'd be more relevant to list the organizations that participated in this. And this is an official FAA process known as the safety risk assessment process. So that's what we were referring to.
Thank you, John. I'm going to refer this next question to David. And the question is, what is the difference between today and 10 or more years ago when the last remodel happened? Will we be having the same conversation in 10 to 15 years? If there is no new growth to meet, is there a plan to downsize plans and spending? David, excuse me, I think you need
There
to
we go, I got
unmute
it.
yourself. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, 10 years ago was a long time in aviation, whether it be here in San Antonio or in Chicago, Illinois, or Peoria, you know, Wisconsin. And so things change. And so now we're at a place where we know, and for all the reasons that John laid out, that there is a need for an upgrade in service, that there are opportunities to better meet the measure as to safety, as we just spoke about, the runway decoupling and the processes. Therefore, you look at the standards for a design of terminal width, and that has upgraded to a new best management, best design practice. And so this process that you are involved in right now with your question are informing our way to make a better airport today and a better airport 10 years from now. And I think it's very intelligent that this panel, this group of professionals and community sought to look not 10 years or 20 years even, you know, normally it's a 20-year master plan. We're going to do that too. But to look 50 years out and say, if we have a continued level of growth, then what do we look like? And so what we know for certain right now with the information that we have, there's going to be a proposed master plan, and we will be striving to meet all of the requirements or the prescription or that which is prescribed in the master plan. So thank you for your question.
Thank you, David. I'm going to direct this question to Ryan. Will Terminal A and Terminal B be torn down?
So as John had mentioned in the presentation, we're still very much in the process of working out the terminal alternatives right now. However, Terminal A, as John mentioned again, is about 40 years old, and so is in drastic need of a major overhaul anyway. The challenge that we face when phasing in new gates is we have to build new gates before we can. So I think the short answer is that Terminal A will likely evolve into a brand new structure at some point down the line in the phasing. I think Terminal B, what happens with that is still very much up in the air, and we're still, again, working on all of the plans for the concepts for the final terminal options.
Thanks, Ryan. And a related question, but I'll pass this one on to Tracy, and that is, will there be a need for 3 terminals? Tracy, I think you might be on mute.
You are correct, Gretchen. I was on mute. As we
Thank
get
you.
into the planning for the terminal facilities at the airport, we will be looking at demand and only building what you need, plus a little bit to accommodate a little bit of growth while you're planning for the next phase of your terminal. And as shown in the schedule for the SDP in John's presentation, that's sort of in the area that we're in right now. We're looking at airfield phasing, terminal phasing, and all of the other elements of the projects that will come out of the master plan and developing the phasing for those. So there could be a need. Our numbers tell us that there probably is a need for additional gates, and it could be accommodated with 3 terminals.
Thank you, Tracy. The next 2 questions I'm going to take the liberty of grouping together because they're somewhat similar, and I'm going to direct them to Mark. I'll ask both of the questions, Mark, and then maybe you can just put them together in one answer. Have you considered space for more VIP lounges? That's the first question. And the second question is, how many gates will there be in Terminal C?
So the first question, the airlines and passengers have brought that issue. There's only one airline lounge presently in Terminal B, and American has to share it with United just because there isn't space available, and all the airlines are interested in that. And the airport itself could also include a a lounge that's just like an American Express type of lounge that you don't have to be a frequent flyer. You just pay to go there. And I know that's very much in the plans of the terminal going forward, that we make space and accommodate that. The second question is how many gates in Terminal C. That we know how many gates are needed, around 35 in the 2040 timeframe. How that is laid out is what we're in the middle of. So Terminal C or gates in that direction west of Terminal B could be anywhere from 12 gates to maybe 15 gates. So we just don't know exactly right now, but that's generally where things are looking.
Thank you, Mark. The next question is for John. For terminals, what factors or guidance is being considered for assisting passenger movement to various areas, such as moving walkways? For those with limited walking distance capability, is there a criteria for when mobility assistance is provided? For example, extent of distance needed to walk without available moving sidewalk? Or is there a design criteria limiting the maximum walking distance?
Question about walking distances and assisted travel through the terminals. We very much are looking at that. In fact, that's one of our evaluation factors between the different concepts is overall walking distances. And as those distances increase, we would provide in those concepts for automated people movers. There's no hard and fast number out there that says at this distance you must have assisted moving sidewalks basically. But we're using typical industry standards to keep walking distances minimal. We know that as the population is aging right now, that more people require assistance with traveling longer distances. So that is very much part of what we're looking at. Also, those widths you saw of the concourses earlier are sized to allow moving sidewalks all throughout so that they can be put in from day one.
Thank you, John. I will ask the next question of David. Is it safe to assume that the airport property will not expand north in the next 20 years?
Sorry again.
Thank you, David.
I say, as we're going, and we will keep saying this, we're in a planning stage right now, right? And we make projections based on enplanements, on aircraft movements. And right now, we're calling for an extension of what John proposed of up to 10,000 feet. And we think that that gives us a goodly amount of reach and access to the world market in aviation in a way to increase our throughput. And beyond the 20 years, again, as we're in a planning stage right now, it's not told by this, but certainly out to the 20 years, the plan is what was presented today, and that's out to the 10,000 feet in the fence line at the highway there. And John, if you have anything to add, please.
No, I think that captures it, David. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Mm-hmm.
John, did you have an addition that you wanted to make to the?
I just realized I
Oh.
misspoke when I used an acronym. We're using too many, I suppose. I said APM for Automated People Mover. That's more of a train system. I meant moving sidewalk, as in area you walk on that just takes you at ground level down the concourse. That's what I meant, but I accidentally said Automated People Mover, APM, which is a whole different ball game. We did consider those early on, but that's not really something we're focusing on. The moving sidewalks is what I was referring to. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Mm-hmm.
I will address the next question to Ryan. Slightly off topic, but essential for future planning. Have mass transit options from the airport to downtown and key business areas been studied as well?
Sure. So yes, we have been coordinating with VIA quite extensively to make sure that mostly that we accommodate their plans at the airport. So looking at either bus rapid transit or maybe in the long range future, light rail of some type. And we obviously at the airport really want to encourage transit use and to make sure that our passengers and our airport employees can get to and from the airport in a quick way that also helps with greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you, Ryan. The next question I'm going to address to John. Is there any discussion of extending 13 left also?
So 13 left is the smaller general aviation runway that you saw earlier. When that runway ultimately past the planning period becomes the parallel runway, it would be extended, and that's what we had shown in those images from March last year. It would be extended and widened to serve as a parallel air carrier runway, but again, that's not until probably well beyond the planning period, probably 30, 40 years out. But that is the ultimate sort of beyond the current planning period, so 50-year time frame thinking. Yes.
Thank you, John. I'm addressing this next question to Tracy. For San Antonio's future air needs, have you considered building a second airport, a standalone facility, at a location further north, following on Houston's 2 airport structure?
So as part of phase 1, John indicated that we looked at will the airport fit to accommodate the region's growth and the region's air traffic demand for the next 50 years. And it can be accommodated on the existing airport site. It's a long and lengthy process to open another airport. And even if you started today, it would probably take over 30 years to get that airport built by the time you did all the feasibility studies, got FAA funding, did the environmental studies and everything required to build another airport. The other big thing is finding a piece of land that's big enough to accommodate growth for the future in another location.
Tracy, thank you. I will direct the next question to Susan. How many gates are there now? Susan, sorry, we missed you. I think you were on mute. Thanks.
All right, I believe we have 23 gates right now combined between terminals A and B.
23 gates. Thank you, Susan. Mark, this next one is for you. Is traffic flow at and around the airport being considered? Are there plans to expand public transportation, that is via access to the airport?
Yeah, the quick answer is yes to both of those. As part of our study, when we started, we actually did a traffic counts all throughout the airport and adjacent to it to understand the traffic flow at the peaks in the mornings and in the evening. So we're addressing those with the land use and roadway plans that we're developing presently. In addition, as like Ryan said, we are in coordination with the TxDOT and VIA with their roadway plans and their future transit plans. Right now, VIA is proposing a bus line initially from the north to the airport to downtown and back and forth. So the line goes right adjacent to the airport, so there will be a connection in the future. And we're providing space to allow for that to occur when VIA gets to that point.
Thank you, Mark. The next question is going to be for Ryan. Ryan, what airlines will be considered to be moved into Terminal C?
So the process to decide which airlines go to what gates will happen much further down the road. However, most of the plans or the options that we're looking at do include having the customs facility or the federal inspection production station in what would be the new gates. So we might anticipate that the international carriers could move over to the gates over at sea if that plan goes forward as we're looking at it.
Thanks, Ryan. Question for David. Why would we remodel Terminal B if it was rarely used?
You know, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure what the person means by rarely used. In airport sort of time, it's, I won't say an old terminal, but it is aging. And it has, I think, significant use. I mean, we are in the way of medium-sized airports, we're one of the fastest airports in keeping with the growth of the region and the city itself. So underutilized, I don't think that fits. But certainly, you know, as Terminal A is 40 years old, you know, you want to handle all things at once, right? And so as long as you mobilize to address one issue, development, then you address an adjacent one, you know, with the spirit of raising the whole structure, right? The whole organization, the whole construct of SAT at once. So that's really what we're doing. And as we, you know, rework and maintain A until the rest of the program grows, we're going to also, you know, in the plan, we'll be adding a third terminal. So does that answer the question?
Thank you, David. So we are at our time limit on questions, but I have one, I'm going to ask John. He has got a wrap-up comment. If you'd be so kind as to make that, John.
Can I duck in real quick?
Oh, sure.
Pardon my manners, and I know there's a time frame here, and you're the orchestrator, but just real quick, there was a couple of questions, and it was about the runway and how we deal with safety issues, and it was about you know, building a new airport and all of that. And as we have folks online that are outside of this process, and maybe those that haven't been ensconced in this with us as it goes, this team is very careful and attuned to the process, right? And all of that is about process. So a lot of what we're doing, we're sharing with the public, but we're also following very closely as to the measured way and requirements of the Federal Aviation Administration, planning agent, the City of Chicago building departments and codes and EPA and all of that. So just saying that, you know, we're glad to be able to share this process with you, but understand also the care that goes into the work that we're presenting today. And I appreciate you guys for doing it.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
John?
Yeah, that touches on what I was going to mention when it comes to a second airport or a new airport. Gretchen and Tracy answered that question, but there's just so many questions we still get about that topic that I did want to add real quick. That, as David just mentioned, the environmental process would need to approve such an initiative. FAA would have to approve that. They signed off on that. Also, FAA would have to fund it, and FAA has made it very clear in some of its guidance. We did a white paper that's actually on the website back in 2018, that if the existing site, airport site, can meet needs, then there is no need for a new airport, and FAA will therefore not fund it. Also, environmentally, you then have no justification for it, so it's very unlikely it would get environmental approval. And then lastly, the Houston comment, you know, there are cities that have more than one airport, mostly that grew to be that way. You know, these airports go back to the 40s or sometimes before that, and it ended up that way. That's not how you would be able to do it today necessarily, certainly in a city the size of San Antonio with a competing airport to the north already. Putting another airport in the middle there somewhere would also dilute traffic for the airlines. which is not a good thing from a business perspective. So it wouldn't help anything. So for all those reasons, there is not going to be another airport. That ship has sailed. Austin has a good new airport. This airport can meet the needs. There's not going to be another airport in this region. And if people are interested in that topic, we'll leave it at that here now, but they can go to the website and please read that white paper. It really outlines the process, and you can see, you know, that we're not just telling you this. This is how the industry works, and that's how FAA looks at things. So thank you. I just wanted to add that because it's an important topic.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for the clarification. John, thank you for the clarification. I'll just mention that we'll be showing the website address several times before we end tonight. The SDP has a special section of the San Antonio Airport website. So thank you all for the questions you submitted, both in advance and at this meeting. If your question wasn't answered tonight and you'd like to be contacted directly with an answer, please provide your name, email, phone number, and a reference to the question you asked in the Q&A function on the screen, and we will respond to you later. If you'd like to submit questions or comments after the meeting, you can do so by emailing your questions to satfuture@sanantonio.gov or call the SDP telephone hotline, which is 210-203-3403. We will provide this information to you again at the end of the meeting. We are now going to make a transition into a briefing that is focused on the airport's development principles related to sense of place, along with an opportunity for you to ask questions. I will now turn the meeting over to Dennis Viehmeyer, who is Manager of Construction and Development for the San Antonio International Airport. Dennis and his team will take it from here. Dennis?
Thank you, Gretchen, and thank you everyone for joining us. As Gretchen indicated, my name is Dennis Viehmeyer. I'm the Manager of Construction and Development for the airport. Concurrent with, but separate from the Strategic Development Plan, we are also working on development principles, including design guidelines and standards for the airport. The purpose for these principles and guidelines is to give our airport a cohesive visual appearance and provide a sense of place unique to San Antonio. Christine Rajpal with Jacobs is a consulting team's senior architect and aviation buildings delivery leader, who has been leading our development principles and airport design guidelines and standards project. She will present an overview of the project, and at the end of the presentation, we welcome your feedback and questions. I will now turn it over to Christine. Christine?
Thank you, Dennis. So our presentation on development principles will focus primarily on the San Antonio Airport Design Guidelines. The agenda for the discussion is to go over what we have done to date and show you where we are going and review the next steps that will be taken in order to get there. Looking at the project objective, goals, and schedule, we start off with the what, with respect to what are development principles, guidelines, and standards. They're an established framework for design and construction of capital projects, a set of criteria providing parameters while maintaining flexibility and encouraging design creativity and innovation, key decision-making tools enabling effective and efficient implementation of projects, and a set of standards for development of future capital improvements. Moving next to the why, the benefits of development principles, guidelines, and standards include an improved San Antonio image, establishing a cohesive visual appearance, an enhanced unique sense of place, an improved passenger experience, increased resource utilization, efficiency, and focus, increased cost effectiveness and construction efficiencies, reduced operational and maintenance costs, enhanced capital improvement programming, and established connection to the airport strategic development plan. So what was not mentioned here is any specific project. So it's important to note that the design guidelines and standards are not a specific project or building. They're words to describe how the airport will look and feel through implementation of future projects. And this will be wrapped up hand in hand with the SDP and will be implemented on all future projects going forward. Taking a look at the map as you see it now, this is a good visual representation of the current state of the airport. As you've likely noticed, the airport is not a cohesive experience, and you can clearly tell from space to space that it was constructed as a series of expansions and additions. So the goals of the standards and guidelines is to provide a unified airport district and a distinct look and feel, which is the San Antonio sense of place that has been mentioned, and providing a cohesive user experience throughout the entire facility, including the existing buildings and any renovations done, as well as any future expansions. Looking at the schedule of what we have accomplished to date, we began with design visioning activities in October of 2019, and we conducted a series of design visioning charrettes. For those of you not familiar with the term charrette, this is really just a fancy architectural word for a collaborative design session. So we held those basically from October of 2019 through January of 2020. We went through a document visioning exercise and moved into concept development. As is consistent with a good portion of the aviation community, our project went on hold due to COVID in April of last year. And this gave us a good opportunity to take a pause and begin a community engagement series of events. So we had engagement presentations to aviation leadership, to city leadership, Airport Advisory Commission, and a briefing to the mayor. And we are now moving towards community outreach with sessions such as this, offering the community at large opportunities to provide input on the principles developed to date. After this is wrapped up, we will move forward with production of the document, and we will finalize the document hand in hand with the strategic development plan in June of this year. And that will allow the concept development phases to proceed as defined by the visioning exercises that we're conducting now. So to dive into the process that we have been going through to date, we've begun several of our work sessions with surveys, and we have found very consistent results. And this has been consistent between different types of groups, whether it be internal to the airport or the external stakeholder groups that have been involved in the charrettes. Some of the questions that were very consistent were the three main drivers of satisfaction for the airport: convenience, customer service, ample space, and ample amenities. And the questions related to San Antonio identity, the responses were consistently that the identity is unclear. And then the largest consensus was when the question was asked, should the airport reflect the identity of San Antonio? The answer was resoundingly yes. The airport's the front door to the city, so it's important that it reflects the city. So looking at the beginning of the project, we did research on other facilities and the type of guidelines that have been published. The consistency here was that they all identified passenger typology. Again, this is another fancy architectural word that really just means what type of passengers are each facility targeting in terms of customer satisfaction, and then a regional identity, and then definition of the principles. So as we move through this process for San Antonio, we worked to identify the passenger segment, to identify the regional identity, and then identify the principles, all of which are unique to San Antonio. When we began the study of passenger typologies, we were fortunate that the airport had just conducted a study doing a similar exercise in September of 2019. And they had identified the passenger segments that you see on the left side of the screen. We worked together with the team to consolidate them. We did not eliminate any of the groups, but rather they were grouped together. And it was decided that the passenger typologies, which will be focused on, will be the leisure traveler, the business traveler, family, assisted needs, military, and employee or tenant. So moving forward into identifying San Antonio's regional identity, we began by an outsider's view of San Antonio. So this is essentially what people who are not members of the community or do not have extensive experience with the city of San Antonio. This is the imagery that is generally associated with San Antonio. And then working through our first series of charrettes, we refined these images into the categories of history, business and industry, military, adaptive reuse, and the vibrant family San Antonio experience. The next step was evolving these into a series of principles. So development of the principles was really a result of analyzing keywords which came up regularly during the first series of charrettes. And those are the 15 words that you see on the screen here. So these words were then refined to form the key principles. And we'll walk through the hierarchy exercise that was conducted. So the first word was really the goal, and that word is gateway. So San Antonio Airport as a gateway to the city of San Antonio, as well as a gateway to the rest of the world. Then we have the words undiscovered, approachable, and authentic. And these words describe San Antonio as a destination and really are key words that set San Antonio apart from other cities. The words technology, business, and industry are important elements that you will see represented throughout each of the principles. So then we have art, fiesta, and cuisine, which really live under the heading of culture. And culture is a key component of the community principle. And that leaves the four remaining principles of community, military, nature, and history. So these four principles are really the differentiators of San Antonio and why you would choose San Antonio over another destination when you have many choices. As mentioned in the beginning, the thought is that these principles are the words that the airport will look and feel like as future projects proceed. So from this point, we began to develop each of the principles. And this is an image from one of the design charrettes. We took each of the principles, and the participants in the charrette brought various images to the table, which really spoke San Antonio to them. And we identified keywords or key phrases associated with image as describing why that image was important to each individual. So the result of that activity, you'll see imagery on the right, and these are images that were repeatedly selected by many of the individuals participating. And the quotes that were on the sticky notes for community were cross-cultural, colorful, social and active, a festive atmosphere, connection, coming together to eat, and business and industry. And those are words that resonated with each individual related to the images selected. So along the same lines with military, the quotes were, "We honor our military, military as a community, importing others, military as aviation, a good military mix with citizens and events, and our international relations to Latin America." With the nature principle, quotes were enjoying nature with friends, relaxation, the German influence of the hill country, family time, conservation, research, and pockets of research. And the history principle, quotes here were immigrant diversity, history is still alive, and our original families still live here. Perseverance and reuse, the blending of old and new, crossroad of thousand-year footpaths, and our mission's Spanish heritage. So out of these conversations, we've established as a team key phrases associated with each of the principles. So community, we have Hispanic but multicultural, color as celebration, and I think this is an important one that you see not only through the imagery represented here, but just as you move throughout the city. Color is very predominant and a big part of the culture of San Antonio. Additionally, day versus night. During the day, San Antonio is about business and industry, and at night, it's about coming together and celebrating. And this comes into play when we start to look at the use of color and the use of light. And then one of the most important phrases associated with community is authentic. There is a desire that San Antonio be represented as its authentic self, and we don't want to take a path of the Disneyland effect, but rather show the true authentic San Antonio. Looking at military, order is the obvious answer for the first one here, but more importantly and very special to San Antonio is integral. Military is a priority of San Antonio, and the benefits can be seen throughout the city. They have a prominent presence amongst the people and provide a sense of comfort. And additionally, military is family. In San Antonio, we welcome military into our homes. We respond to the nomadic nature of the military by celebrating with the military and welcoming military as part of our families. The principle of nature is about celebrating the river, preservation and conservation. As everyone is aware, the river being synonymous with San Antonio itself. And then additionally, nature as a connector. Nature brings people together, a celebration with nature, and nature as a common thread which is woven through the community. And then lastly, we have history. Old versus new. Adaptive reuse is very prevalent, and it's important to honor and recognize the juxtaposition of the old and the new. History as an attractor. People obviously go to San Antonio to see the missions and to remember the Alamo. And then neutral as a backdrop. You see a lot of use of natural beige tones from the limestones. This provides a neutral backdrop for color and diversity of the city to be set on top of and to really pop. So to get into the next steps of the process, as I mentioned, right now we're in the community engagement phase, and we're really looking for feedback to be incorporated to reinforce the principles that have been established. So please do provide your feedback. Feel welcome to submit any images if you feel like there's any key elements missing or any additional words, and we'll take those into consideration and incorporate them into what you've seen today. So we have the principles established, the key phrases associated with each principle. And the next step will be to take these words and these images and translate them into design elements that can be used by various architects and designers who will be engaged on future projects. So to describe this in simple terms, design elements such as materiality, what materials might be used, looking at the use of light, looking at the use of color, and looking at form. What you've seen today from the strategic development plan has been primarily two-dimensional, but we'll start looking at establishing a framework and a set of parameters for the third dimension to be implemented on future projects. Obviously, furniture and standards around furniture will be important. And as we mentioned earlier, the use of technology will be woven throughout all the principles. Again, the result here will be establishing the framework that provides a unique San Antonio travel experience. Looking ahead, the design team will then evolve initial concepts, which will encompass the visioning, and then we'll review those at subsequent charrettes. And feedback from the charrettes and from the engagement meetings will be used as the basis for the documentation phase. The documentation phase is really just consolidating everything into a design visioning book. It's really a live document that will be accessible to anyone on the website. So the use of the term book is not going to be bound and published other than electronically. And that wraps up the presentation component, and we're ready to move into the question and answer series.
Thank you, Christine. We will now go to the question and answer portion of this session. A few reminders. Please use the question feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. And as with the previous presentation, we may group questions together based on related topics in order to attempt to answer all questions received. I would also like to introduce, in addition to Christine Rajpol, another member of the project team who has been working on this project, Greg Bronhel. He's a lead designer with Jacobs.
Nice to be here.
So the first question we have here, and I will direct that to Christine. Will we have access to things like the plans or the visioning book throughout the process?
The plans and the visioning book will be available on the website. So they will be available, published to the public, as well as any designers working on future projects.
Thank you, Christine. Craig, the next question I'll direct to you. What specific areas of the airport do these standards apply to?
Yeah, it's a great question. The standards themselves, I think as Christine had mentioned in her presentation, are really meant to apply once they're completed. They're meant to apply to any new project that comes on board at the airport. So whether that's something as simple as a remodel or any new sort of elements that are being added to the existing facility, but also for when elements that were discussed in the SDP, such as a newer terminal or an expansion of a terminal, things like that. That's when these design guidelines would be used. So anything new that's coming on board, these guidelines are meant to be a set of rules for designers and consultants to use going forward.
Thank you. I will take this next question, and the question is, does this mean we are taking down the existing airport and building a new one that matches these standards? Well, the answer to that is no. The airport, of course, needs to continue operations and continue operating while we continue to grow. As Craig alluded to in his response to the previous question, this is really for all the new facilities going forward, the additions, remodels, any of the new work, construction work that we have coming up. This next question I would like to direct to Christine. And the question is, how many people were surveyed and when? And what was the most important finding?
I knew you were going to ask an architect to do math in public, Dennis. I honestly don't have the answer for the exact number of people who were surveyed, but we did get input from people at every meeting we had. We had 4 working charrettes, and we've had 6 public presentations now. So everybody was given the opportunity to provide input and comment. And the consistent theme, I think, was that we saw the desire for the San Antonio sense of place, which has been discussed frequently throughout. Again, this is the look and feel of San Antonio, so that when you enter the airport and you move through the airport, you really know that you're in San Antonio and you feel part of the community and part of the authenticity of San Antonio. So that was the most important consistent theme that we saw throughout.
Thank you. And I would just add also that inclusive of all the meetings and a survey that we did as part of this project, we also included previous surveys, which I believe Christine alluded to in her presentation, that the airport had actually conducted of passengers that have arrived and departed through San Antonio. This next question I am going to direct to Craig. Is there an opportunity at the airport to highlight our UNESCO designations, World Heritage Site and Creative City of Gastronomy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really our goal for this whole project is to really kind of celebrate just the vast amount of diversity and kind of amenities that the city of San Antonio offers. And so, you know, while this project doesn't specifically target implementing, you know, specific elements, we do target, again, kind of framing the sort of the essence and the character of San Antonio. And so these are absolutely these elements we want to capture. And ultimately that's up to the airport to implement, but we want to set the guidelines so that things like that are definitely open for opportunity.
Here's an interesting question, and I'm going to direct this to Christine. How do you create their feeling of San Antonio?
So that's about a 46 slide segment that we've eliminated from tonight's presentation. And it gets into a lot of what we call architecture. Basically, we do studies of various elements, and we define an architectural language that sets parameters for design. So design elements, the section we presented on that, which was the materiality, light, color, form, furniture, and technology. Those are basically kind of architecture 101 language that sets a target that designers will strive for. And then the second part of that is the airport will establish a design review committee, and that committee will review designs presented or proposed by the design teams and confirm that the designs are within that set of guidelines.
Next question I will direct to Craig. Did the community express any thoughts or concerns about environmental wellness?
So first off, this is our big public outreach. And so, that's a big point of why we're bringing this to you today, is to field any of these thoughts and comments regarding sustainability and the consideration for the environment when these projects go forward. I think that's always something that we're striving for, but really it's again, it comes back to projects being implemented, and as Christine alluded to earlier, this isn't the guidelines and standards isn't about a specific project. It's about framework for projects. So absolutely, please send in your comments or thoughts regarding what you mean by environmental wellness, and we'd love to incorporate that.
Thank you. The next, it's actually a question and comment. And again, we appreciate the comments. And I'm going to direct this to Christine, and I will possibly have a follow-up to that. There's no mention of the Cyber Center of Excellence. We have here the National Security Agency and recognized Center of Excellence at UTSA, San Antonio College. Not sure if that includes military affiliates on Security Hill.
So I'm going to refer back to a slide here. And if you see on this slide where we showed the hierarchy of terms, way down here on the bottom in the fine print, economy, emerging markets, industry clusters, cybersecurity, medical, manufacturing, culinary, and energy. These were all terms that came up frequently as well during our various charrettes and presentations. And they will be part of the common threads that are woven throughout each principle. So they were prevalent and they were addressed. Again, they are part of the principles, and the principles are really the differentiators which set San Antonio apart from other destinations.
Thank you. This next one, I'm going to ask if Craig can take, and it's a real short question. Will the design include landscaping?
absolutely. Again, when we talk about setting up a framework and a unified user experience, it really needs to encompass every element of the passenger experience. So from the moment that you decided to turn onto the airport property, the thought behind this is, what is the signage? What does the signage look like? How does it fit into the picture? What is the landscaping that surrounds that? And it's at every entrance. And so as you sort of filter through your journey at the airport, whatever your purpose there is, whether you're traveling or you're a daily user, we want all those elements like landscaping to tie that user experience together. So it's a very important comment. We appreciate that. It's something that is crucial to that unified user experience.
Thank you. The next question I'll direct to Christine. How long will this take?
So assuming that the question is related to the process of the design guidelines and design standards, we'll be wrapping up the design guidelines, which is the visioning exercise, in June of this year. And then we'll proceed forward to the standards, which is where we get to the more prescriptive approach. And it will incorporate what the results of the design guidelines and visioning.
Thank you. There's a comment that popped up here that I think is worth mentioning. And again, we appreciate all the comments and feedback that are coming in, and we'll capture that for this effort. The comment is, San Antonio is as unique as we have now voted twice, and the business community is strongly behind, providing pre-K to our city's children. I believe the theme of honoring our children and youth should be incorporated in the design and functional design. And thank you for that comment, and we will certainly take that into consideration as we continue to take your feedback and input as we develop this effort. The next question, I will also take this next question. Could we integrate more community involvement into what our airport represents? There is no leadership without an involved community. And that's absolutely why we are here this evening, soliciting your input, getting your involvement in this, because ideally, when it comes to our airport, we want people to know when they are flying into and flying out of San Antonio, that they know they're here in San Antonio, Texas. And we have more meetings coming up with different organizations and entities through the rest of the month of February. And we hope to solicit additional input and comments to really get a well-defined design principles for our airport. So the next question I will direct to Christine. Has the design team seen the OKC Airport, which is Oklahoma City, and their modern interpretation of the red clay natural stone of Oklahoma Silver Mist as a potential guide to this one?
So I would say that the interpretation for Oklahoma is great and is specific to Oklahoma. What we mentioned previously and what could be learned from Oklahoma, as an example, we would want to make it relate to San Antonio. And San Antonio is more the beige limestone that you see with the quarries. So we would like to keep that authentic to San Antonio, but appreciate the comment on the reference of Oklahoma. I'd also just like to touch on the conversation of children and mention that that will fit perfectly under the community pillar. So that should be able to be easily incorporated into the established framework.
Okay, thank you, everyone. It appears that is all the time we have for questions. I would like to ask, please, if you could pull up the last slide of our presentation. If your question wasn't answered today and you would like to be contacted directly with an answer, please provide your name, email, phone number, and a reference to the question you asked in the Q&A function on the screen, and we'll respond to you later. You can also email us any questions and provide any comments or feedback at the email address that should be shown on your screen, which is SAT construction, CONST development at sanantonio.gov. Me and the team, thank you for your time, and I will turn it back over to you, Gretchen.
Thank you, Dennis and team. John, before we wrap up, would you like to add any additional information or clarifications?
No, thank you. I think between the presentation and great Q&A, we covered most of what we needed to. Thank you.
Great, thank you. A very sincere thank you to each of you for joining us for this meeting. We appreciate your interest, your passion, your enthusiasm, your questions, and your commitment to being informed about and engaged in planning for the future of the San Antonio International Airport. As a reminder, you may submit comments or questions to the email or the phone number included in your meeting invitation. That email and hotline number are shown on the screen right now. Please submit comments and questions by March 1st, 2021, in order to have your submission included in this meeting report. One last detail. The video of this meeting will be available on the SDP website at sanantonio.gov/SATfuture on Monday, February 15th. Again, many thanks for being with us at this meeting, and we look forward to your continued involvement. Thank you and good night.